podcast, Policy in a Golden State of Mind. My name is Tony Mastria, and thank you for joining me on the inaugural episode of our show. The purpose of this episode is to offer a very brief overview of what the podcast is all about, so you can go forth and enjoy the show. Remember, you can always visit us online at politicalpod.blogspot.com or by checking out our profiles on iTunes and SoundCloud. And I hope you'll consider joining us on social media by visiting facebook.com/politicalpod or by following us on Twitter @politicalpod. This show is produced just once a week, but in the digital world, the conversation is ongoing. With that out of the way, let's get started. As its name suggests, the Politi-Cal Podcast is about public policy in California, which begs two questions. What exactly is public policy, and why focus on California? For starters, public policy is how we choose to confront the issues we face as a state and society. Questions of public policy can be as small and seemingly trivial as whether to put a stop sign or a yield sign at a suburban intersection, or they can be as large and vexing as how to alleviate poverty or enhance national security. For what it's worth, we'll probably spend most of our time somewhere between these two extremes, looking at issues like education, infrastructure, taxes, elections, and of course, since this is California, droughts. While public policy is typically associated with decisions made by government, it also includes the role played by businesses and nonprofit organizations as well. That leads us to our second question. If public policy affects everyone, why focus on California? For one, California is a very large and powerful state by some pretty compelling metrics. If it were its own country, it would have the 8th largest economy in the world, and with a population of nearly 40 million residents, California is the largest state in the country. So large, in fact, that about 1 in 8 Americans lives within its borders. So any issue that affects California is naturally bound to affect a huge portion of the United States, both directly and indirectly. Another reason to study California is that on many issues of public policy, it tends to be a trendsetter for the rest of the nation, for better or worse, depending on your point of view. For example, notwithstanding its current troubles with water conservation, California is routinely recognized as a national leader on environmental regulations, including its stringent restrictions on vehicle emissions and its implementation of the nation's largest carbon cap-and-trade system. In addition, California has been at the vanguard of notable conservative movements in the United States, including the tough-on-crime movement of the 1990s, which saw passage of one of the country's first and certainly harshest 3 strikes and you're out laws, as well as the modern anti-tax movement, which began in earnest with California's property tax revolt of 1978 and continues to this day. In addition to being a large and influential state, there's a third reason I chose to focus on California for this podcast, and that's that California is my home. I was born here, I was raised here, and God willing, I'll probably die here. I've had the privilege of living and working and studying all across this state, and I want to explore and enjoy as much more of it as I possibly can. I love it, I'm fascinated by it, and I couldn't imagine doing this show without it. Now, this podcast is not about me, so I don't plan to talk about myself, but if you'll spare me just 1 minute, I want to explain the style of the show, which requires that I mention a few details about my life and how this podcast arose out of it. As I mentioned, I'm from California, but full disclosure, I'm not in California at the moment. Instead, I'm in Washington, D.C., which, I've heard some people argue, could still be considered an outpost of the state, judging by the number of Californians who end up here. Whatever the case, I came here 2 years ago for grad school and decided to stick around for now. That being said, I'm looking forward to moving back as soon as that opportunity presents itself, so maybe this podcast is a tribute to that long period of homesickness that I found myself in. Otherwise, let's call it a coping mechanism. I'm also a big audiophile, so I love listening to other podcasts, and if you've tuned into this, I suspect there's a good chance that you do as well. I'm endlessly impressed by the number of amazing shows on subjects like science and psychology, business and economics, politics, current events, and more. And I can't help but admire how each show makes the material both interesting and accessible to listeners at all levels of familiarity. So I regret to admit that I've been disappointed with the lack of podcasts that cover public policy, at least as far as I've been able to track them down. So if this podcast contributes anything at all to our broader landscape of knowledge and understanding, it's my sincere hope that it begins to fill in this content gap. Last, I'll say that I'm a history buff, a news junkie, and a policy wonk, and all of these traits will come through in the episodes you hear. To the best of my ability, I'll try to publish once a week, and I'll try to keep each episode to around 20 minutes. That way you can enjoy it in full during a short coffee break or a long bathroom break, both of which I fully endorse. Finally, I want to say that contrary to its name, this show is not only about public policy in California. Broader than that, it's a show about public policy through California. It's my hope and intent that every subject we discuss is relevant and meaningful in some way to residents of all 50 states, which is why, wherever there's a connection or similarity to something that's happening somewhere else, I plan to point it out. And if I miss a connection, I hope you let me know and point it out for me so we can draw on that knowledge in our conversations moving forward. So while California is outwardly the subject of our discussion on public policy, more fundamentally it's just the vessel for us to discuss these issues in a broader American sense. Subscribe to the show and receive new episodes as soon as they're available by visiting our profile on iTunes and SoundCloud, or explore the show at your leisure by visiting our website, politicalpod.blogspot.com. And if you ever have anything to add to the show, questions, comments, suggestions, corrections, I implore you to do so. You can join the conversation by visiting us on social media at facebook.com/politicalpod and Twitter @politicalpod. That's everything I have to say. I hope this episode provides a useful overview of the podcast, and I hope you're as excited as I am to get started. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the show.